At 10:50 on a Wednesday morning, the doorbell rang twice in quick succession, which told me three things. First, that whoever was pushing the button didn't know Nero Wolfe's schedule. Second, that they didn't care. And third, that my peaceful morning of sorting through bills and wondering why Fritz had charged $17 for specialty vinegar was about to end. I was alone in the office, Wolfe being upstairs in the plant rooms communing with his orchids until 11, and Fritz being in the kitchen performing the daily miracle of preparing lunch for a man who considers eating an art form and timing a religion. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, followed by what sounded like knuckles on wood. Through the one-way glass panel, I could see a woman in a dark coat holding what appeared to be a slim briefcase. She had the rigid posture of someone who had made a decision and intended to stick with it, regardless of convenience or common sense. Her hair was pulled back severely, and even through the glass I could detect the set of her jaw that suggested she was prepared to stand there until Christmas if necessary. I opened the door. "Good morning. If you're selling something, we're not buying. If you're not selling something, we're still not buying, but I'm willing to listen." "Are you Archie Goodwin?" Her voice was crisp, businesslike, with just enough tension underneath to suggest that whatever had brought her here wasn't routine. "I need to see Nero Wolfe. It's about a recipe that was burned and a man who may be next." That got my attention. In the hierarchy of things that interest Nero Wolfe, food ranks just below orchids and considerably above most human beings. A burned recipe would be like showing him a murdered symphony. "I'm Goodwin," I said. "And you are?" "Later Voss. I run the Varick Street Culinary Conservatory." She shifted the briefcase to her other arm. "Someone broke into our archives last night and set fire to a single item, a handwritten recipe card from 1947. They left it just damaged enough to make their point, but not destroyed enough to hide what they'd done. And they left this." She opened the briefcase and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to me. I unfolded it and read, "The recipe dies with the liar. One burn to warn, the next burn will be flesh. The typing was neat, professional, the kind you'd get from someone who knew their way around a good machine. The paper was ordinary, the threat was not." "Charming," I said. "Any idea who might want to barbecue your filing system?" "Several," she said, "which is why I need Mr. Wolfe. The police would treat this as simple vandalism, but it's not. The card they burned was irreplaceable, the original recipe for Kuvana paprika, created by Ivana Kirin in 1947. She was a refugee chef who changed how this city thinks about peppers and spices. The recipe has been copied and bastardized for decades, but this was the original, in her own hand, with her personal notes." I glanced at my watch. 10:58. Wolfe would descend at 11 sharp, as he had every morning for more years than I cared to count. "Wait here," I said, and went to the kitchen. Fritz was at the stove, doing something complicated with what smelled like thyme and white wine. He looked up when I entered, his eyebrows raised in question. "There's a woman here about a burned recipe," I said. "Something called Kuvana paprika. She wants to hire Wolfe." Fritz's spoon stopped moving. "Kuvana paprika, the Kirin reduction. You know it." "Know it?" Fritz set down his spoon and turned to face me fully. "Archie, that recipe is legend. Ivana Kirin came to New York with nothing and taught half the city's chefs what paprika could do in the right hands. If someone has burned her original recipe..." He shook his head slowly. "Mr. Wolfe will not be pleased." That was Fritz's way of saying Wolfe would be furious. I went back to Miss Voss, who was still standing in the hall exactly where I'd left her. "Mr. Wolfe will be down in a moment," I said, leading her to the office. "Have a seat and tell me more about this conservatory of yours." She settled into the red leather chair facing Wolfe's desk, keeping the briefcase on her lap. "We preserve culinary history," she said. "Original recipes, techniques, the stories behind dishes that shaped American cooking." We have collections from immigrant families, famous chefs, home cooks whose innovations never got proper credit. The Kirin collection is one of our most valuable. And who knew about it? That's the problem. Too many people. We've been planning a gala exhibition, The Flavors That Built New York, and the Kirin recipes were going to be featured. We sent out publicity, gave interviews, even had a food writer do a piece about it last month. The sound of the elevator announced Wolfe's descent from the plant rooms. At 11 sharp, he entered the office, moving with his characteristic deliberate pace to his chair behind the desk. He glanced at Miss Voss, then at me, his eyebrows rising slightly in question. "Miss Lady Voss," I said. "Someone burned a recipe last night and threatened to burn something more substantial next time." Wolfe settled into his chair, which creaked slightly under his seventh of a ton. "Miss Voss," he said, his voice carrying its usual measured authority. "Mr. Goodwin tells me someone has committed arson against a recipe. Explain." She opened the briefcase again and withdrew a manila envelope. From it, she carefully extracted what had once been a white index card. Now it was brown along one edge, curled and brittle where the fire had touched it. She placed it gently on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the card. I could see his nostrils flare slightly, whether from the lingering smell of smoke or from outrage. I couldn't tell. "Kuvana paprika," he said softly, pronouncing it with the precision of someone who understood its significance. "Ivana Kirin's masterpiece, and someone has deliberately damaged it." "Not just damaged," Miss Voss said. The burned portion contained her personal notes, adjustments she made to the basic recipe, techniques that aren't recorded anywhere else. "We have photographs, but they don't show the subtle pencil marks she added in the margins." Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, studying the damaged card. Finally, he looked up. "Who had access to your archives?" "Our staff, of course. Board members, researchers with proper credentials, and recently, several people connected to the gala exhibition." "Names?" Miss Voss hesitated. "I'd rather not cast suspicion without—" "Madam," Wolfe interrupted, his voice taking on the edge it got when his patience was being tested. "Someone has committed an act of cultural vandalism and threatened violence. Your discretion is admirable but misplaced." "Names?" She sighed. 4 people have shown particular interest in the Kirin collection. Marcus Brennan, our head curator. He's been with us for 8 years and knows the archives better than anyone. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a food historian who's been researching immigrant cuisine. James Cordwell, who owns a chain of restaurants and has been pressuring us to loan him some of our more famous recipes for a cookbook he's planning. And she paused. Ramin Ardebili. He was our biggest donor, pledged matching funds for the gala. He died last week of a heart attack. "Died when, exactly?" I asked. 6 days ago. The funeral was Monday. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "And the timing of this incident?" "Last night. The note was on my desk this morning when I arrived." "Who else knew you were coming here?" "No one. I made the decision at dawn and came directly." Wolfe was quiet again, his eyes moving between the burned card and the threatening note. I could see the wheels turning behind his massive forehead, sorting through possibilities, weighing motives, calculating angles. "Miss Voss," he said finally, "you will provide me with complete files on each of the individuals you mentioned. You will also arrange for me to examine your archives and interview your staff. My fee is $10,000, plus expenses." She didn't blink. "Done." "Archie," Wolfe said, turning to me, "you will accompany Miss Voss to the conservatory this afternoon. Examine the scene, interview the staff, and bring me a complete report. I want to know not just who had access, but who had motive." As Miss Voss gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Wolfe held up one hand. "One more question. The deceased donor, Mr. Ardebili, what was the nature of his interest in the Kirin collection?" He claimed his grandmother had worked in Ivana Kirin's kitchen in the 1940s. He wanted to honor her memory by featuring the recipes prominently in the exhibition. He was quite insistent about it. After she left, I looked at Wolfe, who was still staring at the damaged recipe card. "So," I said, "we're protecting paprika from pyromaniacs. Should be interesting." Wolfe picked up the card with careful fingers, holding it to the light. "Archie," he said quietly, "this is not about paprika. This is about truth. Someone believes that destroying the evidence will destroy the fact. They are wrong, and I intend to prove it." He set the card down gently. "Go. Bring me faces to attach to these names. And Archie, be particularly attentive to anyone who speaks of authenticity with unusual passion. In my experience, those who shout loudest about truth are often the ones with the most to hide." I got my hat and coat, wondering what we were really walking into. A burned recipe card, a dead donor, and a threat that promised escalation. In the world of Nero Wolfe, where food was sacred and truth was everything, someone had just declared war on both. It was going to be an interesting afternoon. The Varick Street Culinary Conservatory occupied the top 2 floors of what had once been a spice warehouse, back when the neighborhood smelled of cardamom and profit instead of gentrification and good intentions. Miss Voss led me through the main exhibition floor, past glass cases displaying everything from handwritten menus to cast-iron skillets that had probably cooked their last meal when Coolidge was president. "The archives are upstairs," she said, guiding me toward a narrow staircase. Climate-controlled, security cameras, the works. Or so we thought. The second floor was all business, metal shelving, filing cabinets, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're dying of something unpleasant. The air was cool and dry, with a faint smell of old paper and something that might have been dried herbs. Miss Voss stopped at an oak table near the center of the room, where a circular scorch mark about the size of a coffee cup had been burned into the wood. "It happened right here," she said. "The card was left on this table after a research session yesterday afternoon. Our security cameras cover the entrances and the perimeter, but not individual workstations. The fire suppression system only activated after someone had already put out the flames." I examined the burn mark, then looked around the room. Who was the someone who put it out? Dr. Vasquez. She was working late, smelled smoke, and came running with a fire extinguisher. Convenient timing. That's what I thought. Before Miss Voss could elaborate, a man's voice interrupted from behind us. "Leda, I hope you're not suggesting that Elena had anything to do with this unfortunate incident." The voice belonged to a tall, thin man in his 40s, who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts by someone who'd run out of the good stuff. His handshake was damp and brief, and he had the nervous energy of a man who counted things for comfort. "Marcus Brennan," he said. "Head curator. This is all very distressing, very irregular. We've never had a security breach in 8 years. "When did you last see the recipe card?" I asked. "Yesterday afternoon. I was pulling items for the gala display. The Cuvana paprika card was going to be our centerpiece. We'd just had it photographed for the catalog." He dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing. It's barbaric. Anyone else show particular interest in it recently?" Brennan glanced at Miss Voss, then back at me. "Well, there was some discussion about authenticity. Dr. Vasquez had questions about the provenance, and Mr. Cordwell was quite insistent that we loan it to him for his cookbook project. He said it would be criminal to keep such an important recipe locked away." "What kind of questions about authenticity?" "You'd have to ask Elena herself. She's very thorough, sometimes too thorough, if you ask me. Always seeing problems where the rest of us see history." Just then, a compact woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly appeared from behind a bank of filing cabinets. She was carrying a stack of old cookbooks and wearing the expression of someone who'd been listening to a conversation she didn't much like. "Marcus," she said, her voice crisp as autumn leaves, "I don't see problems. I see questions that need answers. There's a difference." Miss Voss made the introductions. Dr. Elena Vasquez had the firm handshake of someone who'd spent years fighting for respect in rooms full of men who thought food history was women's work. "You had concerns about the Kirin recipe?" I asked. I had questions. The card appeared authentic. Right paper for 1947. Handwriting matched other Kirin samples we have. But the pencil markings in the margins bothered me. They looked too fresh, too deliberate. Meaning what? Meaning someone might have enhanced the original card more recently, added notes to make it seem more valuable than it actually was. She set down her stack of books and fixed me with that direct stare. I was still investigating when this happened. Now the evidence is gone. Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "Elena, you never mentioned any of this to me, because I wasn't ready to make accusations without proof. But now." She shrugged. "Perhaps someone wanted to destroy the evidence before I could complete my analysis." "Or perhaps," I said, "someone wanted to destroy your analysis along with the card." "Where were you last night between 8 and midnight, Doctor?" "At the Columbia Library until 9, then home. I live alone, so I can't prove it. But I had no reason to destroy something I was trying to authenticate." "And you, Mr. Brennan?" "At home, grading papers. I teach a night class at the community college. Culinary history. You can check with my students." As we walked back through the archives, Miss Voss was quiet. Finally, she said, "Elena's always been suspicious of everything. It's what makes her a good researcher, but sometimes I think she sees conspiracies where there are only coincidences." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe she sees things other people prefer to ignore. Tell me more about this James Cordwell character." "He owns Cordwell Kitchens, upscale restaurants, mostly in Manhattan. He's been after us for months to loan him recipes for a coffee table book he's planning. America's Lost Flavors or something equally grand. He offered us a substantial fee." "And you turned him down?" "We don't loan original documents for commercial purposes. It's against our charter." James wasn't happy about the decision. I spent another hour going through security logs and staff schedules. Everyone had an alibi, or at least a story that sounded plausible. The night crew consisted of one elderly security guard who'd been in the break room making tea when the fire alarm went off. He'd seen no one enter or leave the archives. Walking back to the brownstone, I thought about what I'd learned. A nervous curator with access and opportunity. A suspicious researcher who might have discovered fraud, or might have been covering up her own doubts. A businessman who'd been told no and didn't like it. And somewhere in the background, a dead donor whose grandmother may or may not have worked for Ivana Kirin. The burned recipe card was starting to look less like vandalism and more like the opening move in a game where the stakes were higher than anyone wanted to admit. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to destroy a piece of paper, but they'd also gone to considerable trouble to make sure everyone knew they'd destroyed it. In my experience, people who want to hide things don't usually announce what they're hiding, which meant the real secret wasn't the recipe card itself. It was something the recipe card could have revealed. I just hoped we could figure out what that something was before the person with the matches decided to graduate from paper to flesh. Fritz was cooling chicken stock in an ice bath when I got back, which meant soup for dinner and the kind of culinary meditation that made him hum Puccini under his breath. I gave him the 30-second version: charred card, nervous curator, suspicious researcher, and got the grim nod that said anyone who messed with Ivana Kirin's legacy would personally answer to his ladle. Wolfe was in his chair, a book on Byzantine agriculture open on his lap, when I entered the office. I settled into my chair and gave him the full report, starting with names and ending with the smell of old paper and newer fears. He listened with his eyes half closed, stopping me 3 times. Wants to clarify the exact position of the burn mark relative to the ventilation system. Wants to have me repeat Dr. Vasquez's precise words about the pencil notations, and wants to ask about the security guard's tea-making schedule. "Pfui," he said when I finished. "A vandal who announces his vandalism is not destroying evidence, he is creating it." "Evidence of what?" "That someone wishes us to believe in destruction rather than creation." He closed the book and set it aside with the deliberate care he reserved for ideas worth preserving. "The note speaks of liars, Mr. Goodwin, not recipes. Someone has decided that truth requires fire." Before I could ask him to elaborate, the phone rang. I answered to find Lon Cohen on the other end, sounding like coffee and deadlines. "Goodwin, you calling to tell me about the paprika that went up in smoke?" "Word travels fast, Lon. What have you got on a ramen ardibili?" "Deep pockets, deeper connections. Tech money in the 90s, real estate after that, philanthropy lately. The obit got space because he filled auditoriums and wrote checks. You working an angle?" "Always. Any chatter about why he stopped breathing?" "Officially, heart attack at home. Unofficially, he'd taken some hits on private investments. There's also noise about a family dispute, ex-wife and a niece, estate getting messy. And one thing you didn't hear from me. A freelancer pitched a story last month claiming Ardebili had a habit of inserting his family into historical narratives where they didn't necessarily belong." "Name of the freelancer?" "Alva Mero. Food beat with a nose for scandal." "Want an introduction?" "Maybe later. Keep your ears open." I hung up and passed along the information. Wolfe grunted at inserting his family into historical narratives, the sound he makes when modern habits offend his sense of order. "Miss Mero," he said, testing the name like a wine that might have turned. "Arrange an appointment for tomorrow afternoon. I want her observations before they become accusations." I was reaching for the phone to make the call when the doorbell rang twice in quick succession. Through the one-way glass, I could see a man in an expensive overcoat holding what looked like a peace offering, a bottle of something that caught the light like liquid amber. James Cordwell entered ahead of his cologne, which tried to negotiate with my sinuses before he did. He was maybe 55, with silver hair that had been barbered by someone who charged by the strand, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to check the price of anything. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, extending a hand that was soft but not weak. "James Cordwell. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I should come forward with information that might be relevant to your investigation." Wolfe glanced at the bottle. Cognac, and not the kind you find at corner stores. Then at Cordwell. "Sit. Speak." Cordwell settled into the red leather chair, setting the cognac on the side table with the reverence of a man who understood good liquor. "I understand you're investigating the incident at the conservatory. I may have information that could be helpful." "Proceed." 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call from someone claiming to have access to the Kirin recipes. They offered to sell me copies for $10,000. That got my attention and Wolfe's. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That I wasn't interested in stolen property." "I may be a businessman, Mr. Wolfe, but I'm not a fool. If I'd wanted those recipes illegally, there are easier ways than breaking into archives." "Did you recognize the voice?" Wolfe asked. "No. It was disguised, muffled, distorted. Could have been anyone, man or woman." "When exactly was this call?" "October 15th, a Tuesday. I remember because it was the same day I had my final meeting with Miss Voss about my cookbook project. She'd just turned down my offer to license the recipes for $25,000. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "And you told no one about this mysterious offer?" "I told my assistant to make a note of it in case the caller tried again. But no, I didn't report it. I assumed it was some kind of test. Someone trying to trap me into doing something unethical." A reasonable assumption, Wolfe said. What changed your mind about coming forward? The fire. If someone was willing to destroy the originals, it suggests they have copies they consider more valuable, or they're trying to eliminate evidence of something. Cordwell leaned forward slightly. I may be a businessman, Mr. Wolfe, but I'm also a collector. The idea of destroying irreplaceable documents horrifies me. After Cordwell left, taking his cognac with him since Wolfe hadn't offered to open it, I looked at my employer. So someone tried to sell him the recipes 3 weeks ago, and now someone's burning them. That's either very bad timing or very good planning. Or, Wolfe said, someone wanted Mr. Cordwell to have that information when he needed it most. He closed his eyes, the sign that his brain was working on problems I couldn't see. The sequence troubles me, Archie. First, an attempt to sell. Then, a public announcement of an exhibition featuring the very items offered for sale. Then, destruction with maximum visibility. Someone is orchestrating revelation. The phone rang again. This time it was Miss Voss, her voice tight with worry. Mr. Goodwin, something else has happened. Dr. Vasquez received a package this afternoon, photocopies of documents from our archives, things that should have been secure. And there was another note. What did it say? The liar has been identified. Last chance to confess. I looked at Wolfe, who had been listening. He opened his eyes and nodded slightly. Miss Voss, I said, don't let Dr. Vasquez go anywhere alone. We'll need to see those documents first thing in the morning. After I hung up, Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the office walls. Finally, he said, someone is forcing a confession, Archie. The question is whether they want to hear the truth or whether they've already decided what the truth should be. And if Dr. Vasquez doesn't confess to whatever they think she's done, then I suspect we'll discover what they meant about flesh burning. He reached for the button that would summon Fritz. Arrange for Miss Voss, Dr. Vasquez, and Mr. Brennan to be here tomorrow evening at 8. We will begin to separate the authentic from the enhanced. What about Cordwell? Mr. Cordwell will come when he realizes he needs us more than we need him. Wolfe's smile was thin as paper and twice as sharp. In the meantime, we have a mystery that begins with a dead donor, continues with a burned recipe, and threatens to end with something considerably more permanent. Someone believes that destroying evidence will destroy truth. They're about to learn otherwise. Fritz appeared in the doorway, and Wolfe turned to him. Fritz, what do you know of Kuvana paprika? Ah, Fritz said, his face lighting up like a man who'd been asked about his first love. The Kirin reduction, a masterpiece of balance. Sweet paprika, hot paprika, tomato, and the secret that made it sing. She understood that cooking is not about ingredients, Mr. Wolfe. It is about the spaces between them. And if someone claimed the recipe was not entirely original, Fritz's expression darkened, then someone would be saying that the spaces between the notes do not belong to the composer. It would be. He paused, searching for the right word. Unforgivable. As Fritz returned to his kitchen and Wolfe reached for his book, I sat back in my chair and thought about spaces between notes, and liars who needed to confess, and the kind of person who would burn history to make a point. Tomorrow was going to be interesting, assuming we all lived to see it. Thursday morning brought the kind of gray sky that makes you wonder if the sun had called in sick, and it matched my mood perfectly. I was in the kitchen getting coffee when Fritz appeared at my elbow, holding a red and gold tin like it might explode. This came with the morning delivery, he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled outrage usually reserved for people who put ketchup on steak. Hungarian sweet paprika, according to the label. I took the tin and examined it. The seal looked intact, the label crisp and professional. And the problem is, he opened it and held it under my nose. The scent hit immediately, smoky, with an undertone of oak and campfire that had no business being in Hungarian sweet paprika. Spanish, Fritz said, each syllable weighted with disgust. Pimenton dulce. Someone has switched the contents. I looked closer at the lid. There was a fine grey dust pressed into the grooves, ash by the look of it, deliberately placed. Where exactly did this come from? Bloch and Sons, supposedly, but the delivery boy was new. Miguel, filling in for their regular man. Fritz's expression darkened further. And there is this. He pointed to the crimp around the edge of the lid. Wrong. The factory crimp is uniform. This has been opened and resealed. I carried the tin into the office, where Wolfe was reading a monograph on Byzantine agriculture with the concentration of a man solving world hunger. I set the tin on his desk and explained the situation. He didn't touch it. Instead, he leaned forward, inhaled once, a barely perceptible flare of the nostrils, and sat back. Pimenton, he said. Someone wishes to educate us about authenticity, or warn us that they know where we live and what we eat. Both. He studied the tin with the attention he usually reserved for prize orchids. They are escalating from symbolic destruction to personal intrusion. Call Bloch and Sons. Verify they sent nothing. Then take this to someone who can confirm the label has been tampered with. Bloch and Sons swore on 6 generations of spice merchants that they'd sent us nothing Spanish. Our tins have the Caloxa seal stamped into the metal, old Mr. Bloch said, offended by the suggestion. If yours doesn't, someone's been playing games with labels. Sewell Brenner's print shop on 10th Street smelled of ink and expertise. He turned the tin in his hands, clicked his tongue, and delivered his verdict. Labels been steamed off and reapplied. Glue residues all wrong for factory work. This was a kitchen job. Whoever did it wasn't a perfectionist either. The crimps off by maybe a degree. By the time I got to the conservatory, Dr. Vasquez was waiting in the archives with the tight-lipped expression of someone who'd received more unwelcome mail. She handed me a manila envelope without preamble. Messenger delivery this morning, she said. No return address, just my name and this address. Inside were photocopied documents, old ledger pages with spidery handwriting, an accession form dated 2014, and another typed note on plain paper. The liar has been identified. Last chance to confess. The accession form made me whistle. Donor, Ardebili Foundation. Item, Kirin recipe card. Condition, good. Annotations, minor pencil notations as per family notes. Initialed, MB. Marcus Brennan knew about the pencil markings when the card was donated, I said. Which means they weren't original to Ivana Kirin, Dr. Vasquez replied. The ledger pages are even more damaging. They're from Kirin's personal account book. We have the original in deep storage. These entries suggest she purchased or adapted elements of the Kavana paprika recipe from an older Hungarian source. It wasn't entirely her creation. And Brennan knew about your research. I discussed my preliminary findings with him a month ago. He called them potentially damaging to the conservatory's reputation and advised me to drop the investigation. I found Brennan at his desk, surrounded by index cards like a man building a paper fortress. When he saw the photocopies, what little color he had drained from his face. This is preposterous, he whispered. Elena's theories would destroy Ivana. Kirin's legacy. The conservatory can't afford that kind of scandal. So you chose to suppress legitimate research? I chose to protect the institution. His voice cracked slightly. Mr. Ardebili was very clear about his expectations for the exhibition. He wanted Kirin presented as a singular genius, not someone who built on existing traditions at all. At 3 o'clock, Alva Mero arrived at the brownstone with the rain, shaking water from a coat that had seen better decades. She settled into the red leather chair with the confidence of someone who'd spent years asking uncomfortable questions. Mr. Wolfe, she said, opening a bulging satchel, I understand someone's been playing with matches and family histories. Wolfe studied her with interest. Miss Merrow, Mr. Cohen suggests you have insights into Mr. Ardebili's relationship with historical accuracy. I have facts, she said, spreading photographs across his desk. Ramin Ardebili had a pattern of discovering family connections to famous chefs just before making large donations to culinary institutions. San Francisco, New Orleans, now here. Each time, the documentation was real, but creatively interpreted. She handed me a black and white photograph, showing two women in aprons standing in a restaurant kitchen. One was clearly Ivana Kirin. The other was younger, darker, smiling confidently. The problem, Miss Merrow continued, is that I found 3 other versions of this photograph in different archives. In one, the second woman is Maria Santos, a Portuguese cook. In another, she's Anna Kowalski, Polish. Ardebili's version identified her as his grandmother, Soraya Ardebili. The same photograph, different stories, Wolfe observed. Exactly. And according to my sources, the real Soraya Ardebili worked in a bakery in Tehran until 1952. Wrong continent, wrong decade. After Miss Merrow left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence. Finally, he said, "We are dealing with multiple deceptions, Archie." Mr. Ardebili fabricated his family's connection to Miss Kirin. Someone enhanced the recipe card to support that fabrication. And now someone is systematically exposing these lies while threatening violence. The question is whether they want justice or revenge. An excellent distinction. Tonight's gathering will clarify which. He reached for the button that would summon Fritz. Call Miss Voss. I want every document related to Mr. Ardebili's donation, including the original photograph, and arrange for Mr. Cordwell to join us this evening. He needs to understand that his cookbook project has become considerably more complicated. What about the paprika substitute? A message that our opponent knows this house and its habits. They are confident enough to enter our world, which means they believe they hold all the advantages. Wolfe's smile was thin and sharp. They are about to discover otherwise. Fritz appeared in the doorway, and Wolfe turned to him. If you discovered that a treasured recipe was not what it claimed to be, what would you do? Fritz considered carefully. I would be disappointed, Mr. Wolfe, but not angry. A good dish is good regardless of its parentage. But if someone had lied about the recipe for money or fame... He shrugged. That would be theft, and theft demands justice. As evening approached and the rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, I thought about the web we were untangling. Academic fraud, institutional pressure, fabricated family histories, and someone willing to burn evidence and threaten lives to keep their version of the truth intact. Tonight's gathering was shaping up to be more than a simple interrogation. It was going to be a reckoning, and somewhere in the city, someone was deciding whether Dr. Vasquez had confessed enough, or whether the next fire would need to be considerably more personal than a recipe card and a mislabeled spice tin. The brownstone felt like the eye of a storm, with Wolfe at its center, orchestrating the forces that would soon converge in his office. The truth about Cuvana paprika was about to be served, and I had a feeling not everyone was going to like the taste. By 7:30, the brownstone had acquired the controlled tension of a theater before curtain. That particular hum of anticipation when everyone knows the performance is about to begin, but nobody's quite sure how it will end. Fritz had prepared a light consommé with herbs that nobody was eating, and I'd arranged the office chairs in a careful semicircle that would let Wolfe see every face while keeping the suspects just uncomfortable enough to stay honest. The phone had rung twice in the past hour. First, Saul reporting that our sedan-driving friend had made contact with someone at the Four Seasons Supper Club, a house manager named Parker who'd accepted an envelope and disappeared back inside. Second, Dr. Vasquez calling to report that someone had tried her apartment door and left a matchbook under it. Four Seasons Supper Club, with 3 burned matches inside and no note. Fred's watching the alley, I told Wolfe as he settled into his chair with the deliberate care of a man who intended to stay put until the truth emerged. Saul's got eyes on the restaurant. Nobody's getting in or out of here without us knowing about it. Satisfactory, Wolfe said, arranging the various documents, photographs, and evidence on his desk like a general preparing for battle. When our guests arrive, they will find themselves in a controlled environment where lies become difficult to maintain. Miss Voss arrived first, clutching a leather portfolio and wearing the tight-lipped expression of someone who'd spent the day wondering if her career was about to go up in flames. Marcus Brennan shuffled in behind her, looking like he'd been sleeping badly and eating worse, his nervous energy practically vibrating through his rumpled suit. Dr. Vasquez came next, her gray hair pulled back severely and her eyes holding the kind of sharp focus that comes from being threatened and deciding not to back down. James Cordwell was the last to arrive, and he brought the evening's first surprise, a compact woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she was used to being the smartest person in the room. "My attorney, Sarah Chen," Cordwell said smoothly, settling into his chair as if he owned it. "Given recent events, I thought legal counsel might be prudent." Wolfe glanced at the attorney, then back at Cordwell. "You anticipate needing protection from accusations, Mr. Cordwell?" "I anticipate needing protection from false accusations," Cordwell replied. "Someone's been playing games with evidence and threatening people. I prefer to be prepared." When everyone was seated, Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man who'd finally gotten all his pieces on the board. The burned recipe card lay before him, along with the photographs, the threatening notes, and the tampered paprika tin, evidence of a campaign that had escalated from academic fraud to personal invasion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice carrying its characteristic measured authority, "we are here because someone has decided that truth requires fire, and lies require punishment. They have burned evidence, threatened violence, and violated the sanctity of my home with spurious paprika. This ends tonight." He picked up the first photograph, the one showing Ivana Kirin with her supposed assistant. "Miss Merrow's research has revealed that Mr. Ardebili had a pattern of inserting his family into culinary history, where they did not belong. This photograph appears in 3 other archives, with 3 different identifications of the same woman. None of them is Soraya Ardebili." Dr. Vasquez shifted forward in her chair. "That confirms my analysis of the recipe card. The pencil notations were added later to support a fabricated family connection." "By whom?" Wolfe asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but the timing was clear. The notations appeared after Mr. Ardebili made his donation, not before. Brennan cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to buy time he didn't have. "If I may, Mr. Wolfe, we're making too much of this. Donors often embellish family histories. It doesn't justify arson or threats." "No," Wolfe agreed, "but it provides motive for someone who discovered the deception and decided justice required exposure." He slid the accession form across the desk. "Mr. Brennan, this form details the donation of the recipe card by the Ardebili Foundation. It notes minor pencil notations as per family notes. You initialed this form. What were these notations?" Brennan's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "They were enhancements. Mr. Ardebili claimed they were insights from his grandmother, cooking times, specific peppers, methods for toasting spices. He said they were crucial to the true Cuvana paprika." "And you accepted these as authentic?" I asked. "He was a major donor," Brennan blurted, then caught himself. He was very passionate about his grandmother's connection to Ivana Kirin. The notations seemed harmless. "Harmless," Wolfe repeated, the word carrying the weight of judicial pronouncement, "until they become the foundation for institutional fraud. Dr. Vasquez, show us what your research revealed about Miss Kirin's methods." Dr. Vasquez opened her folder and withdrew photocopied pages covered in spidery handwriting. These are from Kieran's personal account book. They show payments made to a chef Andras for paprika reduction techniques in 1946 and 1947. Ivana Kieran didn't create Kuvana paprika from nothing. She adapted and perfected an existing Hungarian recipe. Which means, Wolfe continued, that Mr. Ardebili's family secrets were doubly fraudulent. Not only did his grandmother never work with Miss Kieran, but the recipe itself was not Kieran's original creation. Miss Voss was staring at Brennan with a mixture of betrayal and fury. "Marcus, did you know about this?" Brennan's composure finally cracked. "I suspected something was wrong, but Mr. Ardebili was so insistent, and the funding was vital for the new wing. He threatened to pull his entire donation if we questioned the provenance. The conservatory was facing closure. What was I supposed to do?" "Tell the truth," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Instead, you tried to silence my research when it threatened your comfortable lie." "I was trying to protect the institution." "You were protecting your reputation," Wolfe corrected. "And when Dr. Vasquez's investigation threatened to expose your complicity, someone decided more drastic measures were required." He picked up the threatening note. "The language is instructive. The recipe dies with the liar, suggests the writer believes both the recipe and its supposed creator are fraudulent. But one burn to warn implies they see themselves as delivering justice, not committing vandalism." Cordwell's attorney was taking notes, but Cordwell himself was studying the room with the calculating gaze of a man reassessing his position. "Mr. Wolfe," he said carefully, "you seem to be suggesting that someone killed Ardebili to prevent him from defending himself against these accusations." "I'm suggesting that Mr. Ardebili's death was remarkably convenient for someone who needed his fabrications exposed but wanted to avoid direct confrontation." Wolfe's gaze moved around the room. "Consider the sequence. Dr. Vasquez discovers problems with the authentication. Mr. Ardebili becomes anxious about her findings. He dies suddenly of apparent heart failure. Within days, someone begins systematically exposing his deceptions while threatening the person who could provide expert testimony about the forgery." The room had gone very quiet. Even the rain outside seemed to have paused, as if the city itself was waiting for the next revelation. "But the person orchestrating this campaign made one crucial error," Wolfe continued, reaching for the tampered paprika tin. "This morning, someone sent me Hungarian paprika that had been replaced with Spanish pimenton. The label had been carefully removed and reapplied, and ash from the burned recipe card had been pressed into the lid. He set the tin on the desk where everyone could see it. This required knowledge of my household habits, access to professional labeling equipment, and the confidence to intrude directly into my personal space. It also required something else, familiarity with the difference between Hungarian and Spanish paprika, the kind of knowledge that comes from professional cooking experience." Miss Voss was staring at the tin as if it might explode. "Who would know about your spice preferences?" "Someone familiar with fine cooking," Wolfe said. "Someone who understood that Fritz would immediately recognize the substitution. Someone who wanted to demonstrate that they could reach into this house whenever they chose." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Someone who had access to restaurant-quality labeling equipment and the professional connections to arrange surveillance and message delivery through the Four Seasons Supper Club." Cordwell had gone very still, his lawyer's pen frozen above her notepad. "Mr. Cordwell," Wolfe said softly, "when exactly did you discover that Mr. Ardebili's family connection to Miss Kieran was fabricated?" "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I think you discovered it well before his death, and I think you used that knowledge to ensure he would never be able to defend himself against exposure." The room erupted, Chen objecting, Brennan protesting, Miss Voss demanding explanations. But Wolfe raised one hand, and gradually the noise subsided. "We will continue this discussion in an orderly fashion," he said. "But first, I believe Dr. Vasquez has something to tell us about her relationship with the late Mr. Ardebili. Don't you, Doctor? Dr. Vasquez looked around the room, her face pale but determined. Yes, she said quietly. I do. And it's going to change everything you think you know about this case. Outside, the rain resumed its steady drumming against the windows, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment to continue. The truth was finally beginning to emerge, and I had the feeling that before the night was over, more than one carefully constructed lie would be lying in ruins on Wolfe's desk. The real revelation was still to come, and judging by the expression on Dr. Vasquez's face, it was going to be worth waiting for. Dr. Vasquez sat perfectly still for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone who had spent years handling delicate documents. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had been carefully preserved, like recipes passed down through generations. My relationship with Ramin Ardebili, she said, began long before I ever heard of the Culinary Conservatory. My grandfather was Andras Vasari, the chef Andras mentioned in Ivana Kirin's account books. Brennan's nervous fidgeting stopped entirely. Miss Voss leaned forward, her expression shifting from confusion to comprehension. Cordwell's attorney paused her note-taking, sensing that the ground beneath her client was about to shift considerably. Andras Vasari came to New York in 1946 with nothing but his knowledge of Hungarian cooking techniques, Dr. Vasquez continued. He worked in Hell's Kitchen boarding houses and briefly, very briefly, in Ivana Kirin's kitchen. He taught her the paprika reduction method that became the foundation of Kuvana paprika. She paid him for the technique because she understood its value. He sold it because he needed money to bring his family to America. Wolfe inclined his head slightly. And Mr. Ardebili's connection to this history. When Ardebili made his donation and began promoting his grandmother's supposed role in Kirin's kitchen, I recognized the timeline immediately. My grandfather kept meticulous records, dates, payments, techniques taught. I realized that Ardebili was inserting his family into my grandfather's actual history. She opened her folder and withdrew a set of photocopied documents. These are from the National Archives, immigration records for Soraya Ardebili. She didn't enter the United States until 1953, 6 years after the Kuvana paprika recipe was already established. She went directly to Los Angeles and worked in her cousin's bakery until 1961. She never lived in New York, never worked in restaurants, and certainly never assisted Ivana Kirin. And you confronted Mr. Ardebili with this evidence? Wolfe asked. 3 weeks ago, I called him and explained what I'd discovered. I offered to handle it quietly, perhaps present the recipe as part of a broader tradition of culinary adaptation rather than as Kirin's singular creation. That would have preserved both his grandmother's dignity and the historical record. His response? Dr. Vasquez's professional composure wavered slightly. He became desperate. He begged me to suppress my findings, offered me research grants, even a position with his foundation. When I refused, he admitted that the pencil notations on the recipe card had been enhanced to support his story. Brennan made a small, strangled sound. Wolfe's gaze moved to him briefly, then returned to Dr. Vasquez. He told me that Marcus had been cooperative in making the donation more meaningful to the conservatory, she continued. When I pressed for details, he broke down completely. He said it had started as a small embellishment, adding a few family stories to make the donation more personal, but it had grown beyond his control. And then, I prompted. He had what appeared to be a severe anxiety attack, difficulty breathing, chest pain. I offered to call for medical help, but he refused. He said he needed time to think, to figure out how to make things right without destroying everyone involved. Her voice dropped. He died 2 days later. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. Finally, Wolfe spoke. You believe your confrontation precipitated his death. I know it did. The coroner ruled it a massive coronary, but I saw his face when I showed him the immigration records. He realized his entire philanthropic legacy was built on a fabrication, and the weight of that knowledge. She shrugged helplessly. His heart couldn't bear it. "So you decided to manage the revelation yourself," Wolfe observed. "The burned recipe card, the threatening notes, all designed to force institutional confession while protecting a dead man's reputation." Dr. Vasquez straightened. "I broke into the archives. I burned the card, not to destroy it, but to highlight the fraud. The pencil notations were the key evidence of tampering. I knew Marcus had signed off on them under pressure from Ardebili. I wanted to force the issue without directly accusing a dead benefactor." "The note threatening flesh?" I asked. "Theater," she admitted. "I needed to create urgency, to make everyone take the fraud seriously. I never intended to hurt anyone. The paprika substitution was meant to demonstrate that I could reach into your world, Mr. Wolfe. That this wasn't just academic vandalism, but a serious investigation of institutional corruption." Cordwell had been listening with the focused attention of a man recalculating his position. "Dr. Vasquez," he said carefully, "what about the surveillance at the Four Seasons? The matchbook left at your apartment?" "I don't know anything about those," she replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "I've never been to the Four Seasons Supper Club, and I certainly didn't leave my self-threatening materials." Wolfe's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Indeed. Which suggests we have been dealing with two separate campaigns, not one." The implications settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Two people, working independently, trying to manage the same crisis through different methods. "Mr. Cordwell," Wolfe said, his voice taking on the edge it got when patience was running thin, "perhaps you would care to explain your parallel investigation." Cordwell glanced at his attorney, who gave him a slight nod. "After Ardabili's death, I realized someone was orchestrating revelations about the Kirin collection. Given my interest in licensing those recipes, I needed to know who was behind it and what their agenda might be." "So you hired surveillance?" "I hired a private investigator to monitor the situation. Yes. When Dr. Vasquez began receiving threatening materials, we thought she might be the next target, not the perpetrator. The matchbook was meant to draw attention to the Four Seasons connection. Ardebili used to conduct business there." "And your interest in the recipes themselves?" Cordwell's composure slipped slightly. "If the Kirin recipes were going to be exposed as adaptations rather than original creations, they would lose their commercial value for my cookbook project. I needed to understand the scope of the fraud before making any publishing commitments." Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man who had finally separated wheat from chaff. "So we have Dr. Vasquez attempting to force institutional honesty through symbolic destruction, and Mr. Cordwell attempting to protect his commercial interests through private investigation. Two people managing the same crisis, each unaware of the other's involvement." "But what about Ardabili's death?" Miss Voss asked quietly. "Was it really just the stress of exposure?" "Mr. Ardebili died of the weight of his own deceptions," Wolfe replied. "Dr. Vasquez provided the catalyst, but the reaction was inevitable. A man who builds his reputation on fabrications lives in constant fear of discovery. When that discovery finally came, his body simply couldn't sustain the psychological burden." He picked up the burned recipe card, holding it with careful fingers. "The real tragedy is not that Ivana Kirin adapted an existing technique. All great cooks build on tradition. The tragedy is that Mr. Ardebili felt compelled to fabricate a connection that diminished both his grandmother's actual achievements and Miss Kirin's genuine innovations." "What happens now?" Brennan asked, his voice barely audible. "Now," Wolfe said, "you will prepare an honest exhibition that celebrates both Ivana Kirin's contributions and the broader tradition of culinary evolution she represented. You will acknowledge that the recipe card contains later additions, and you will present the true story of how great dishes develop through cultural exchange. He set the card down gently. Dr. Vasquez will publish her research, complete with proper attribution to Andras Vasari and context about the pressures that led to the falsifications. The truth will be told, but it will be told with understanding for all involved. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, I noticed that the rain had stopped. The brown stone felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of accumulated lies had finally been lifted from its walls. "Satisfied?" I asked Wolfe after everyone had gone. "Satisfied that truth has emerged without bloodshed," he replied, saddened that it required such elaborate deception to surface. The authentic Kuvana paprika, Andras Vasari's technique as perfected by Ivana Kirin, is undoubtedly more interesting than any fabricated version. He closed his eyes, the signal that he considered the case concluded. Innovation through. Collaboration is more admirable than creation from nothing, Archie. Tomorrow we return to orchids and the simple pleasure of meals prepared without deception. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, thinking about the spaces between truth and fiction, and how sometimes the most important discoveries come not from what people create, but from what they choose to preserve, adapt, and honestly pass along to future generations. The mystery of the burned recipe was solved, but the real recipe for integrity, authenticity, and the proper acknowledgement of culinary heritage would continue to develop in kitchens and consciences long after the last threatening note had been forgotten. The brownstone settled into its familiar quiet, and somewhere in the city, the truth about Kuvana paprika was finally free to be what it had always been, not the creation of a single genius, but the beautiful result of tradition, adaptation, and the honest collaboration between two skilled cooks who understood that the best flavors come from building on what came before. The morning after brought the kind of deceptive calm that makes you think the storm has passed, when actually it's just moved inland to gather strength. I was in the office by 8:30, typing up notes from the previous evening's confessions and revelations, when Fritz appeared with coffee and the expression of a man who'd discovered something unpleasant in his morning deliveries. "The paprika situation troubles me, Archie," he said, setting down the cup with unusual care. "I've been thinking about the timing." "What about it?" "The tampered tin arrived the morning after Dr. Vasquez burned the recipe card, but before anyone knew she had done it. Someone anticipated her actions, or..." He paused, his brow furrowed. "Someone wanted us to believe she was responsible for both incidents." That got my attention. I'd been so focused on the institutional fraud and academic confessions that I'd missed the timeline problem. "You're saying someone else sent the paprika?" "I'm saying someone with access to our supplier sent a message that implicated Dr. Vasquez while she was busy implicating herself." Fritz's expression darkened. "It suggests coordination, or at minimum, parallel campaigns with similar goals." Before I could pursue this line of thinking, the phone rang. It was Lon Cohen, and he sounded like a man who'd been digging through files since dawn. "Goodwin, I've got something on your Ardabili situation that you're going to find interesting. Remember how I mentioned he had a pattern of inserting his family into culinary history?" "Yeah. Well, it turns out he wasn't working alone. I found 3 other institutions in the past 5 years that received major donations accompanied by similar family stories. The New Orleans Culinary Heritage Foundation got $50,000 and a tale about his great-uncle's connection to Creole cooking. The San Francisco Food History Project got $75,000 and documentation about his cousin's role in developing fusion cuisine. The Chicago Immigrant Kitchen Archive got $40,000 and materials about his grandfather's influence on deep dish pizza. All fake, all unverifiable, and all involving donors who died within 2 years of making their contributions. But here's the kicker. Each institution used the same authentication service to verify the historical documents. A company called Heritage Validation Services, run by a guy named Marcus Holt. I felt the familiar chill that comes when a case you thought was closed suddenly develops new teeth. Marcus Holt. Any connection to our Marcus Brennan? That's what I'm checking now. But Archie, there's something else. Heritage Validation Services has been authenticating culinary documents for institutions across the country. If they've been systematically creating false provenance, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar fraud operation. After I hung up, I went to find Wolfe, who was in the plant rooms communing with his orchids. When I explained Lon's findings, his reaction was immediate and decisive. Archie, we have been manipulated. The Ardebili fraud was not an isolated incident of philanthropic vanity. It was part of a systematic operation to monetize fabricated culinary history. He set down his watering can and fixed me with the look he gets when someone has personally offended his sense of order. Someone has been creating false authenticity on an industrial scale, and Dr. Vasquez stumbled into it. Dr. Vasquez threatened to expose it. Her research methodology, if applied to other institutions, would reveal the pattern. The burned recipe card was not symbolic vandalism. It was an attempt to discredit her before she could examine other collections. We returned to the office, where Wolfe immediately began making calls. Within an hour, he had confirmed that Heritage Validation Services had authenticated documents for all 4 institutions Lon had identified, and that Marcus Holt had been Marcus Brennan's graduate advisor 15 years earlier. The connection is established, Wolfe announced. Mr. Brennan was not merely a nervous curator protecting his institution. He was an active participant in a fraud network that spans multiple cities and institutions. So, what's our next move? We expose the network before they can eliminate the evidence. Dr. Vasquez's confession last night was genuine, but incomplete. She discovered one fabrication. We must now reveal the system that created dozens. He reached for the phone. Call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have evidence of interstate fraud involving cultural institutions. Then call Miss Voss and inform her that her troubles are far from over. As I made the calls, I thought about the web we were untangling. What had started as a burned recipe card and a threatened food historian had become something much larger, a systematic corruption of cultural memory. A business built on selling fake authenticity to institutions desperate for prestigious collections. The brownstone might have felt calm this morning, but somewhere in the city, people were realizing that their carefully constructed fraud was about to be exposed on a national scale. The real confrontation was still to come, and this time, it wouldn't be contained to a single office or a single institution. By the time Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11, I had arranged for a very different kind of gathering than the one we'd held the night before. This time, we wouldn't just be dealing with academic dishonesty and philanthropic vanity. We'd be taking on an entire industry built on the systematic falsification of American culinary history. The truth about Cuvana paprika had been just the beginning. Now we had to uncover the truth about who was selling America's food heritage to the highest bidder and why they thought they could get away with it in Nero Wolfe's city. Fritz appeared in the doorway with lunch, and Wolfe turned to him with unusual solemnity. Fritz, if someone had been systematically falsifying the provenance of classic recipes, claiming false origins, fabricating family connections, creating entire mythologies around dishes, what would you call such a person? Fritz considered this carefully. I would call them a thief, Mr. Wolfe. Not of ingredients or techniques, but of stories. And stories, he added with quiet intensity, are what make food into culture. Precisely, Wolfe said, and we are about to serve justice to some very accomplished thieves. Inspector Kramer arrived at 3:15 with the expression of a man who'd spent his morning discovering that fraud was more creative than he'd previously imagined. He settled into the red leather chair and lit a cigar that could have doubled as a flare, while I opened a window to preserve Fritz's delicate sensibilities about the office atmosphere. "Wolfe," he said without preamble, I've been talking to the FBI about your heritage validation situation. They've had Marcus Holt under surveillance for 2 months, but they were focusing on tax evasion and interstate commerce violations. Your call yesterday opened up a whole new angle they hadn't considered. Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms at 11 sharp, surveyed the assembled evidence on his desk, and settled into his chair with the deliberate care of a general reviewing battle plans. "Inspector," he said, "what is the Bureau's current assessment?" "They want to move fast. Holt's operation spans 4 cities, and there's evidence of systematic document fabrication going back at least 5 years. But there's a problem. Someone's been destroying evidence since yesterday evening. 3 satellite offices have gone dark, and they're shredding documents as fast as they can feed the machines." I looked at Wolfe, who was steepling his fingers in the gesture that meant he was arranging facts into patterns. "Someone warned them," I said. "The question is whether it was Brennan protecting his network or whether our investigation yesterday was observed. Or," Wolfe said quietly, "whether Dr. Vasquez's confession was more strategic than we initially understood." The phone rang before any of us could pursue that uncomfortable possibility. It was Saul, reporting from his surveillance post near Heritage Validation Services' Queens warehouse. "They're moving fast," Saul said. 3 trucks have loaded boxes since dawn, and there's been steady traffic in and out. But here's the interesting part. Marcus Brennan arrived an hour ago with 2 suitcases and hasn't come out. "Stay with it," I told him. "Fred's still watching the 4 Seasons. Fred's got the restaurant covered, and Ori's been working his contacts in the food service industry. The network's bigger than we thought, Wolfe. Holt's got people placed in archives and museums from here to San Francisco." After I relayed Saul's report, Wolfe was quiet for several minutes, his eyes closed in the concentration that meant his brain was working through possibilities I couldn't see. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at Kramer. "Inspector, the Bureau must delay their raid by 24 hours. I need time to separate the authentic victims from the willing participants." "Wolfe, I can't sit on a federal investigation because you want to tidy up loose ends. You can if you want to ensure that innocent families aren't destroyed along with the guilty parties." Wolfe's voice carried the edge it got when moral principles were at stake. Heritage Validation Services didn't just fabricate documents, they corrupted family memories. Some of their clients were willing conspirators like Mr. Ardebili. Others were innocent families who trusted experts to authenticate genuine but incomplete records. The implications settled over the room like dust after an explosion. We weren't just dealing with institutional fraud. We were looking at the systematic corruption of immigrant family histories, the monetization of cultural memory. "What do you need?" Kramer asked finally. "Tonight I will gather the principals in this office. Dr. Vasquez will provide testimony about her research methodology. Miss Voss will present the institutional perspective, and Mr. Brennan will explain his role in facilitating the fraud." "What if Brennan doesn't cooperate?" "He will cooperate," Wolfe said with quiet certainty, "because his only alternative is federal prosecution without the possibility of mitigation." At 4 o'clock, Dr. Vasquez arrived with a leather portfolio and the controlled composure of someone who had spent the day preparing for a difficult conversation. She settled into the red leather chair and waited for Wolfe to begin. "Dr. Vasquez," he said without preamble, "yesterday evening you confessed to burning the Kirin recipe card to expose institutional fraud. Today we have discovered that the fraud extends across multiple cities and institutions. I need to understand the full scope of your knowledge." She opened her portfolio and withdrew a thick folder. "When I began researching the Kirin collection, I wasn't just looking at the Ardebili donation. I was conducting a broader authentication study of immigrant chef documentation. What I found was a pattern of enhanced provenance across multiple institutions." "Enhanced how?" "Original documents that had been supplemented with additional materials, letters, recipe cards, photographs, that supported more dramatic family narratives than the original suggested. The enhancements were technically authentic. Right paper, appropriate inks, correct historical context, but they told stories that were more compelling than the truth. She spread several photographs across Wolfe's desk. This is the pattern I discovered. The same authentication service, Heritage Validation Services, had worked with all the institutions showing enhanced immigrant chef collections. And in each case, the enhancements supported major donations that came with specific exhibition requirements. And you chose to expose this through symbolic destruction rather than direct accusation. I chose to force institutional investigation without destroying families who had trusted experts to authenticate their genuine memories. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with impossible choices. Many of these families had real connections to culinary history. They just weren't as dramatic as the enhanced versions suggested. The phone rang again. This time it was Fred, calling from his post outside the Four Seasons Supper Club. "Archie, you need to know about this. A van just pulled up to the service entrance, Continental Document Solutions according to the side panel. 2 men unloaded boxes and took them inside. One of them was Marcus Brennan." I relayed the information to Wolfe, who nodded as if he'd been expecting it. "Mr. Brennan is attempting to manage the evidence himself. Inspector, I suggest you have your people ready to intercept whatever emerges from that restaurant." "Already on it," Kramer said, reaching for his phone. As evening approached and the office filled with the controlled tension of a case reaching its climax, Wolfe surveyed the assembled evidence, photographs, documents, testimony, and the burned recipe card that had started it all. "Tomorrow evening," he announced, "we will gather all the principals in this office. Dr. Vasquez will present her research. Miss Voss will explain the institutional pressures that made fraud attractive. Mr. Brennan will account for his role in facilitating deception. And we will separate the authentic from the fabricated, the innocent from the complicit." "What about Holt?" I asked. "Mr. Holt will be in federal custody by then, courtesy of Inspector Kramer's coordination with the Bureau. But the network he created, the families affected by his fabrications, and the institutions that trusted his authentication, those require more delicate handling." As our guests prepared to leave, Dr. Vasquez paused at the door. "Mr. Wolfe, what happens to the families who discover their proudest heritage was enhanced?" "They will learn that truth is more valuable than fiction, Doctor. And they will discover that authentic stories, however modest, are worth more than elaborate fabrications." He paused. The real tragedy of Heritage Validation Services was not that they created false documents. It was that they convinced people their true stories weren't worth telling. After everyone had gone, I found Wolfe in his chair, contemplating the burned recipe card that still lay on his desk. "Satisfied with the day's progress?" I asked. "Satisfied that we are approaching resolution without destroying the innocent along with the guilty," he replied. "Tomorrow we will serve justice with precision, not brutality. The truth about Cuvana paprika and about the systematic corruption of culinary memory will emerge intact." He closed his eyes, the signal that he considered the day's work complete. "Fritz has prepared something special for dinner, Archie. Tomorrow we will deal with the complexities of fraud and forgiveness. Tonight we will enjoy the simple pleasure of authentic flavors, honestly prepared." The brownstone settled into its familiar evening quiet, but I could feel the tension building toward tomorrow's confrontation. The case of the burned recipe card had become something much larger, a reckoning with how America tells its food stories and who profits from distorting them. The truth was finally ready to be served, and I had a feeling it was going to be more complex and more satisfying than anyone had imagined. By 8 o'clock Friday evening, the office had acquired the hushed tension of a theater moments before the final act. I'd arranged the chairs in that familiar semicircle that made everyone visible to Wolfe while keeping them just uncomfortable enough to discourage creative storytelling. The burned recipe card lay on his desk like evidence at a trial, flanked by photographs, documents, and the tampered paprika tin that had started our morning 3 days ago. Inspector Kramer arrived first with two plainclothes officers who positioned themselves near the doors with the casual alertness of men who expected trouble but hoped to avoid it. Miss Voss came next, clutching a leather portfolio and wearing the tight expression of someone who'd spent the day wondering if her career would survive the evening. Dr. Vasquez followed, her gray hair pulled back severely, her eyes holding the sharp focus of someone who'd decided to see this through regardless of consequences. Marcus Brennan shuffled in last, escorted by one of Kramer's men. He looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes and eating nothing but regret. His nervous energy had been replaced by the hollow-eyed resignation of a man who'd run out of places to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, his voice carrying its characteristic measured authority, "we convene to separate truth from fabrication, authentic heritage from profitable mythology." The burned recipe card that brought us together was merely the visible symptom of a systematic corruption that extends far beyond this institution. He gestured to Dr. Vasquez. "Doctor, please share what your expanded research has revealed." Dr. Vasquez stood with the composed authority of someone presenting findings that had cost her considerable personal risk. "My investigation into the Kirin collection led me to examine similar donations at other institutions. Working with colleagues in New Orleans, San Francisco, and Chicago, we discovered a pattern. Heritage validation services, operated by Marcus Holt, had systematically created enhanced family narratives, connecting wealthy donors to famous chefs and culinary traditions. She spread photographs across the side table. The same techniques were used everywhere. Authentic-based documents supplemented with fabricated materials that supported more dramatic family connections than the originals suggested. The Ardebili donation followed this exact pattern. "Mr. Brennan," Wolfe said, his gaze settling on the curator with the weight of judicial pronouncement, "explain your role in facilitating these deceptions." Brennan's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Marcus Holt was my graduate advisor 15 years ago. He approached me 3 years back, offering consultation fees for identifying potential donors and ensuring their materials passed through our authentication process without excessive scrutiny. You signed the accession form, noting minor pencil notations as per family notes on the Kirin recipe card," I said. "You knew those notations weren't original." "I knew they were enhancements. Holt convinced me they were based on legitimate family recollections, just formalized for historical preservation. The donation was crucial for our new wing, and Miss Voss was under tremendous pressure from the board to secure major funding." Miss Voss straightened in her chair. "I was aware of donor enthusiasm for family connections, but I trusted our authentication process. I had no idea the extent of the fabrication." "You had suspicions," Wolfe observed. "When Dr. Vasquez began her research, you could have supported her investigation. Instead, you allowed institutional pressure to override academic integrity." "I was trying to protect the conservatory," she said, her voice barely steady. "If the Ardebili donation was compromised, we faced potential closure." Wolfe picked up one of the letters Dr. Vasquez had discovered. "What you fail to understand is that Mr. Ardebili himself was a victim, not a perpetrator. These letters, found in your deep storage, reveal that he had discovered discrepancies in the materials Holt provided and was demanding verification." He read aloud, "Heritage Validation Services has systematically deceived me regarding my family's culinary heritage. I'm prepared to testify about these deceptions to appropriate authorities. I will not allow my grandmother's memory to be corrupted by fabricated connections to famous chefs she never met." The room went very quiet. Even Kramer's cigar seemed to pause in its steady emission of smoke. "Mr. Ardebili died not from shame over perpetrating fraud," Wolfe continued, "but from the stress of discovering he had been victimized by it. Someone had convinced him his family stories were more dramatic than they actually were, then used his donations to legitimize a broader pattern of institutional deception." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward. "Which explains why I felt compelled to act when I discovered the authentication problems. I wasn't just exposing academic fraud. I was vindicating a dead man who'd been trying to expose the same deceptions. Your method was unorthodox, Wolfe said, but your instinct was sound. The burned recipe card forced institutional examination that might otherwise have been delayed indefinitely. What about the threats? Kramer asked. The notes, the paprika substitution. 2 separate campaigns, Wolfe replied. Dr. Vasquez wrote the first note and burned the card to create urgency around the authentication issue. But when she saw the panic it produced, she stopped. The second note on the paprika substitution came from someone else, someone who wanted to discredit her research before it could expose the broader network. Brennan cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to buy time he didn't have. Holt was desperate when he learned about Dr. Vasquez's methodology. He said if her techniques were adopted by other institutions, the entire operation would be exposed. He asked me to discourage her research. By making her appear unstable through escalating threats, I said. The paprika was meant to suggest she was becoming increasingly desperate and irrational. Holt had contacts at restaurant supply companies who could handle the labeling work. Brennan's voice cracked. I never wanted anyone to be hurt. I just wanted the problem to go away. Wolfe surveyed the assembled group with the satisfaction of a man who had finally separated wheat from chaff. The Heritage Validation Services network has been dismantled by federal authorities. Mr. Holt is in custody, facing charges in multiple jurisdictions. The question now is how to address the institutional and cultural damage. What happens to the enhanced collections? Miss Voss asked. They will be re-authenticated using legitimate methodology, Dr. Vasquez said. Many of the base documents are genuine. They simply don't support the dramatic narratives that were built around them. The real stories, while perhaps less sensational, are often more interesting than the fabrications. And the families involved? They will learn that their authentic heritage, however modest, is more valuable than elaborate fiction, Wolfe replied. Mr. Ardabili's grandmother may not have worked with Ivana Kirin, but she was a skilled baker who helped establish one of Los Angeles' first Persian bakeries. That is a worthy legacy that requires no embellishment. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared for the difficult work of institutional rehabilitation, Wolfe made one final observation. The tragedy of Heritage Validation Services was not that they created false documents. It was that they convinced people their true stories weren't worth telling. Innovation through cultural exchange is more admirable than creation from nothing. The authentic Cuvana paprika, Andras Vasari's technique as perfected by Ivana Kirin, is undoubtedly more interesting than any fabricated version. After everyone had gone, I found Wolfe contemplating the burned recipe card that still lay on his desk. Satisfied with the evening's work? I asked. Satisfied that truth has emerged without destroying the innocent along with the guilty, he replied. Dr. Vasquez will publish her research with proper context. Miss Voss will implement rigorous new authentication protocols. Mr. Brennan will cooperate with federal authorities to identify other victims of the network. He closed his eyes, the signal that he considered the case concluded. Tomorrow, we return to orchids and the simple pleasure of meals, prepared without deception. Fritz has promised something special, a dish that celebrates tradition, honestly acknowledged rather than heritage, artificially enhanced. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, thinking about the spaces between truth and fiction, and how sometimes the most important discoveries come not from what people create, but from what they choose to preserve, adapt, and honestly pass along to future generations. The mystery of the burned recipe was solved, but the real recipe, for integrity, authenticity, and the proper acknowledgement of culinary heritage, would continue to develop in kitchens and consciences long after the last fabricated family story had been forgotten. The brownstone settled into its familiar quiet, and somewhere in the city, the truth about Cuvana paprika was finally free to be what it had always been. Not the creation of a single genius, but the beautiful result of tradition, adaptation, and honest collaboration between skilled cooks who understood that the best flavors come from building on what came before without pretending it was something it wasn't. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you believe in fresh starts and second chances, which seemed appropriate given the week we'd just survived. I was in the kitchen getting coffee when Fritz appeared with the morning mail and the satisfied expression of a man whose faith in authentic ingredients had been vindicated. "From Dr. Vasquez," he said, handing me a manila envelope. "And the morning papers have been educational." The envelope contained a handwritten letter and photocopies of what appeared to be original recipe cards covered in 2 different hands of spidery writing. The letter was brief but significant. "Mr. Wolfe, while organizing my grandfather's papers for proper archival storage, I discovered these original recipe cards in Andras Vasari's effects. They document not only the paprika reduction technique he taught Ivana Kirin, but also her subsequent innovations and his adaptations of her methods. Their collaboration was more extensive and more mutual than either recorded in their business correspondence. I thought you would appreciate seeing authentic culinary evolution in its natural form. E. Vasquez." The recipe cards were fascinating, dense with notes, corrections, and marginal comments that showed 2 skilled cooks building on each other's expertise. One card, dated 1948, showed Kirin's technique for balancing sweet and hot paprika, adapted to include Vasari's method for toasting whole spices. Another, from 1949, documented Vasari's version of Kirin's tomato reduction, modified with techniques he'd learned from his grandmother in Hungary. Lon Cohen called at 9:30 with the tone he reserves for stories that write themselves. "Goodwin, clear some space on tomorrow's front page. Heritage Validation Services is going to be bigger than we thought. The FBI task force has identified 43 institutions across 12 states, and they're estimating the fraud touched over 200 family collections." "Any problems with the families?" "Mostly relief, actually. Turns out a lot of people suspected their family stories had been enhanced, but didn't know how to address it without seeming ungrateful. The Bureau's being careful. They're working with cultural historians to separate the authentic base materials from the fabricated additions." When Wolfe descended from the plant rooms at 11, I showed him Dr. Vasquez's discovery. His reaction was immediate and deeply satisfied. "Genuine collaboration," he said, examining the handwriting with the attention he usually reserved for prize orchids. 2 professionals learning from each other, documenting their innovations, building something neither could have created alone. He handed the cards back with careful reverence. "This is infinitely more interesting than any fabricated mythology, Archie. It shows how cuisine actually develops, through exchange, adaptation, and honest acknowledgement of sources." Inspector Kramer called at noon with updates on the federal investigation. "Holt's singing like a canary with a recording contract," he said. "Apparently, he's more terrified of his former clients than he is of federal prosecutors. Brennan's cooperation has been invaluable. He's helping them trace the network back to its origins." "What about the families involved?" "Mixed reactions, but mostly positive. When you tell someone their grandmother's real story is more interesting than the enhanced version, they tend to appreciate the honesty. It's the institutions that are scrambling. Boards of directors don't like discovering their prize collections were built on fabrications." Miss Voss called in the afternoon to report that the conservatory board had voted unanimously to implement new authentication protocols and fund Dr. Vasquez's expanded research into immigrant culinary traditions. "We're calling it the Vasari Kirin Project," she said, "documenting authentic collaboration rather than fabricated connections." "And Brennan?" "Marcus submitted his resignation yesterday. He's cooperating fully with the federal investigation. The board decided against civil action. We're more interested in rebuilding our reputation than seeking revenge." By evening, the case felt genuinely concluded. The burned recipe card had led us to a network of institutional fraud, but it had also revealed the authentic story of culinary collaboration that was more compelling than any fabrication. Justice had been served with precision rather than brutality, and truth had emerged intact. Fritz appeared in the doorway as we prepared for dinner. "I've prepared something special," he announced. "Kuvana paprika, as it was actually created, using both Vasari's reduction technique and Kirin's balancing method, based on the authentic documentation Dr. Vasquez provided." The meal was exceptional, a perfect harmony of sweet and hot paprika, tomato reduction, and the kind of careful seasoning that comes from understanding tradition rather than fabricating it. As we ate, Wolfe made one of his characteristic observations about human nature. The Heritage Validation Service's fraud succeeded because it told people what they wanted to hear about themselves, he said, savoring Fritz's honest preparation. The antidote to such deception is not skepticism, but the recognition that authentic stories are more valuable than enhanced ones. He raised his wine glass in a rare gesture of celebration. Two authentic recipes, honestly prepared, and the people who understand that the best stories require no embellishment. After dinner, as the brownstone settled into its familiar quiet, I found myself thinking about what we'd accomplished. A network of fraud had been dismantled, institutional integrity had been restored, and families had been reconnected with their authentic heritage. The burned recipe card that had started it all would be preserved in the conservatory's archives, properly documented as evidence of both deception and the investigation that exposed it. "Satisfied with the resolution?" I asked Wolfe as he prepared for his evening with his book. "Satisfied that truth has emerged intact and that cultural memory has been restored to honest foundations," he replied. "The mystery of the burned recipe was never really about paprika, Archie. It was about the difference between authentic heritage and profitable mythology." He paused at the office door. "People starve for meaning, and when meaning is scarce, they will buy it adulterated. Mr. Holt sold adulterated meaning. He took honest fragments, added artificial enhancement, and passed it off as heritage. What was stolen was not paper, but the right of modest facts to suffice." As I turned off the lights and locked up for the night, I reflected on the week's events. We'd started with a burned recipe card and a threatened food historian, and we'd ended by exposing a network that had systematically corrupted American culinary memory. But the real victory wasn't the arrests or the institutional reforms. It was the recovery of authentic stories that had been buried under profitable mythology. The real Kuvana paprika, Andras Vasari's technique perfected through collaboration with Ivana Kirin, would be featured in the conservatory's new exhibition celebrating authentic culinary evolution. The story would be told honestly, acknowledging both the Hungarian roots and the American innovations that made it a classic. Somewhere in the city, people were discovering that their real heritage was more valuable than any fiction money could buy. The case of the burned recipe was closed, but the lessons it taught about authenticity, collaboration, and the proper value of cultural memory would continue to develop long after the last fabricated family story had been forgotten and replaced with something infinitely more valuable: the truth. The brownstone returned to its practiced quiet, the orchids reclaimed the air, and Fritz's kitchen resumed its honest work. Another case concluded, another truth preserved, and another excellent meal properly appreciated. In Nero Wolfe's world, that constituted a satisfactory resolution to any mystery, no matter how complex its deceptions or how far-reaching its implications.